If the moon wanted her alive, it would have given her a pack. The words followed Clara Hale into the storm like a curse, swallowed and carried by the screaming winter wind as the iron gates slammed shut behind her for the 5th time. Snow stung her face hard enough to feel like tiny knives of ice, catching in her pale lashes until the world blurred white around the edges. She stood motionless for a moment, her thin coat hanging heavy with melted sleet, one hand wrapped tightly around the fraying strap of the canvas bag someone had thrown at her feet as if she were stray property nobody wanted anymore. Inside it sat half a loaf of stale bread, a cracked canteen, and the same message every pack seemed to give her without saying the words aloud. Survive somewhere else. Behind the gates, muffled laughter drifted through the frozen air. Clara lowered her head before anyone could see the sting in her eyes. 23 years old. And already she had learned there was something worse than being hated. Being pitted. Packless omegas weren't rare. But someone like Clara was different. People whispered when she walked into town. Wolves avoided standing too close to her. Mothers pulled their children away. They said bad things followed her. Crops failed where she stayed too long. Hunting trails dried up. Illness lingered longer than it should. Logic never mattered in a frightened world. Fear always needed someone to blame. The last pack had at least waited until sunset before casting her out. She supposed that counted as kindness these days. Clara adjusted the worn scarf around her neck, though it barely stopped the bitter cold from creeping beneath her skin. Her boots, already split near the heel, soaked through almost instantly as she stepped into the deep snow. The nearest road sat nearly 10 miles south, if she remembered correctly, though memory became dangerous in weather like this. The storm erased everything. Trees disappeared into gray shadows. Footprints vanished within minutes. Even the sky seemed to disappear, swallowed whole by clouds thick enough to smother moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled. Clara stopped breathing for half a second. Not fear exactly. Habit. She had spent years teaching herself to stay invisible. Quiet girls survived longer. Quiet girls weren't noticed. Her stomach twisted painfully, empty for longer than she cared to count. She reached into her bag and broke off the smallest piece of bread she could manage, barely larger than a cracker. Save the rest, she told herself. Just keep moving. Keep breathing. That had become her whole life lately. Keep moving. Keep breathing. Keep surviving one more day than everyone expected. Wind whipped harder across the frozen ridge, nearly stealing her balance. Clara stumbled, catching herself against the trunk of an old pine tree. Her hands had already gone numb, fingers stiff and aching despite being buried deep inside torn gloves. She tilted her face toward the darkening sky, exhaling slowly as snow gathered on her shoulders. Maybe this was it. Maybe the mountain would finally finish what the packs had started. But then she saw it. Faint. Almost invisible through the storm. Smoke. Thin gray smoke curling somewhere beyond the ridge. Warmth meant shelter. Shelter meant another night alive. Clara swallowed hard and forced her frozen legs forward, unaware that somewhere miles away, deep inside the Northern Territory, the most feared alpha king in the country had just received word that something impossible was moving through the mountain storm. The smoke disappeared twice before Clara Hale convinced herself she had not imagined it. The mountain storm twisted everything into shadows and lies, swallowing shapes whole before spitting them back wrong. Her legs trembled with every step now, the cold sinking deeper into her bones until even breathing hurt. Snow had worked its way through the torn seams of her boots, numbing her feet so completely she no longer trusted herself to feel the ground beneath her. She only kept moving because stopping felt dangerous. Stopping meant sleeping. Sleeping out here meant never waking up again. The wind howled through the pines, bending branches low enough to scatter frozen powder into her face. Clara wiped at her eyes with stiff fingers and nearly stumbled down the slope when her knee buckled beneath her weight. Sharp breath escaped her lips. Not pain exactly. Exhaustion. Her body had begun quietly giving up hours ago. She knew the signs. The dizziness. The strange heaviness creeping through her chest. The dangerous temptation to simply sit down for 5 minutes and close her eyes. 5 minutes sounded warm somehow. 5 minutes sounded peaceful. No, she whispered to herself, her voice barely carrying beyond the storm. Not yet. Her stomach twisted painfully again. Empty enough now that hunger had transformed into something dull and distant. She reached into her bag for another piece of bread, then stopped. Only 3 small pieces remained. She slipped her hand back out. Save it. Tomorrow mattered, even if she was not sure why anymore. Somewhere ahead, through the blur of snow, the smoke appeared again. Stronger this time. Real. Relief moved through her so suddenly it almost frightened her. Shelter meant heat. Heat meant another chance. Clara pushed harder, ignoring the ache spreading through her legs, but after nearly 20 minutes the smell changed. Wood smoke faded beneath something else. Wet fur. Pine sap. Blood. She froze. Her pulse stumbled hard against her ribs. Wolves. Not a pack scent exactly, but close enough to make every instinct inside her go painfully still. Slowly, carefully, Clara stepped around a fallen log, her breath catching in her throat. At the bottom of a shallow ravine, half buried beneath fresh snow, something moved. Small. White. A low sound drifted upward, soft enough that she almost mistook it for the wind. A whimper. Clara frowned. It was not human. Not fully wolf either. Her first instinct told her to leave. Smart people left dangerous situations alone. Packless Omega survived by avoiding trouble, not running toward it. But then the sound came again, quieter this time. Weak. Cold. Alone. Something inside her chest twisted painfully. Slowly, she climbed down the icy slope, boots slipping against frozen rock until she reached the bottom. The creature could not have been older than a few months. A wolf pup, silver-white beneath the snow, trembling so hard its body barely seemed able to hold itself together. One front leg bent awkwardly and frost clung thickly to its fur. Bright amber eyes blinked up at her, wary but exhausted. Oh no, Clara breathed, immediately dropping to her knees despite the cold soaking through her jeans. Hey little guy. Her voice softened without thinking. You are okay. You are okay. The pup let out another tiny sound and tried weakly to move before collapsing again. Clara swallowed hard. She knew what cold looked like, what hunger looked like, what abandonment looked like. She saw too much of herself in the shaking little creature. You picked the wrong mountain to get lost on, she whispered, already shrugging off the only dry layer beneath her coat. Somewhere far above the ridge, hidden beyond the storm, dark figures moved silently through the snow, following tracks that should not have still existed. The wolf pup shook so hard Clara thought it might fall apart in her hands. Snow clung to its pale fur in frozen clumps, melting slowly beneath the weak warmth of her trembling fingers. Up close, the little thing looked worse than she first realized. One paw hung strangely, and exhaustion clouded those startling amber eyes until they blinked slower each time they lifted toward her face. Clara swallowed hard against the tight ache rising unexpectedly in her chest. Nobody had looked at her for weeks without fear, suspicion, or disappointment hiding somewhere behind their eyes. But this tiny creature only looked tired, cold, alone, the same way she imagined she looked now. Carefully, she pulled the dry layer from beneath her coat and wrapped it around the pup as gently as she could. There you go, she whispered, though her own teeth had started chattering hard enough to make the words shake. You are warmer already. The lie sounded kinder than the truth. Nothing out here felt warm. The mountain air cut through every layer she owned, stealing heat faster than she could keep it. Her fingers had gone pale and stiff. Even breathing felt heavier now, every inhale sharp enough to settle deep into her chest like ice. The smarter choice would have been to keep moving toward the smoke. Find shelter first. Save herself first. But when Clara tried standing, the pup let out another small sound, weak enough that something inside her quietly broke. No one had stayed for her. Not once. Not when her father died during a winter hunt and left debts nobody wanted to forgive. Not when the first pack decided failed crops meant she carried bad luck. Not when the whispers followed her from town to town until people started locking doors before she even knocked. She still remembered the faces. Sorry, Clara. We cannot risk it. You understand. As if understanding somehow made rejection hurt less. Clara adjusted the bundle against her chest and glanced toward the storm-dark ridge above. The smoke had vanished again, swallowed whole by the weather. Her stomach dropped. Great. Just great. Her laugh came out quiet and brittle. Lost. Cold. Nearly broke. And now apparently responsible for a mystery wolf. The pup blinked up at her weakly before nudging closer against the warmth of her body. Clara froze. The tiny movement felt strangely trusting, as if it had already decided she was safe. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. "You really have terrible instincts, huh?" she whispered softly. But the corner of her mouth lifted anyway, the smallest smile she had managed in weeks. Wind swept hard through the ravine again, carrying a sound she did not recognize at first. Voices. Faint. Far away. Clara straightened immediately. Her pulse stumbled. Wolves. More than one. She could not make out words, only the low rhythm of conversation somewhere beyond the ridge. Instinct tightened painfully inside her chest. Packs rarely searched mountains during storms unless something important had gone missing. Something valuable. Her gaze dropped slowly to the silver-white pup curled against her coat. No ordinary pack wolf looked like this. Even exhausted, there was something strange about it. Familiar somehow. The shape of its ears. The pale shimmer beneath its fur. The way those bright amber eyes seemed too aware for something so young. A sudden sound echoed through the trees. Closer now. Clara stood carefully, tightening her hold around the pup. Snow shifted beneath her boots as she glanced toward the narrow path climbing out of the ravine. She should leave. Right now. Before anyone saw her. Because people never assumed the best about girls like Clara Hale. And deep down, some frightened part of her already knew one terrible thing for certain. Whatever wolves were searching this mountain, they were searching for him. "Please do not make me regret this," Clara whispered, though she was no longer sure whether she meant the storm, the mountain, or the trembling wolf pup tucked against her chest. The voices drifted closer through the snow, low and sharp beneath the sound of wind scraping across frozen branches. Clara moved instinctively, stepping backward until the ravine wall pressed cold against her shoulders. Her pulse beat too fast now, loud enough she thought the wolves above might somehow hear it. Every lesson survival had taught her screamed the same thing. Stay unseen. Stay quiet. Leave before someone decides you are trouble. But leaving suddenly felt impossible. The little wolf pressed closer into the warmth of her coat, trembling harder than before. Its body felt frighteningly cold, lighter than it should have been. Clara frowned, carefully adjusting the fabric wrapped around it. The pup barely reacted. No weak whimper this time. No blinking amber eyes. Just stillness. Fear tightened hard inside her chest. "Hey, no. Come on. Stay with me." Her voice came out softer than she intended, almost shaking. She crouched beneath the shelter of an overhanging rock where the wind eased slightly and touched trembling fingers against the pup's side. Breathing. Still breathing. Barely. Relief hit too quickly, leaving her dizzy. "You are not allowed to quit on me, okay?" she whispered. "I have had enough things leave already." Snow continued falling in thick curtains around them, piling deeper across the ravine floor. Clara glanced toward the narrow slope leading out and immediately knew she could not climb it carrying him. Her legs already felt unsteady. Her body had crossed beyond exhausted into something quieter and more dangerous. Numb. The kind of tired that made people stop caring whether they stood back up. No. Not yet. Keep breathing. Keep moving. But for the first time all day she hesitated. Her eyes searched the ravine walls until she spotted it. Half hidden beneath hanging pine branches sat the narrow mouth of what looked like an old hunter's shelter, little more than a shallow cave carved into stone. Small. Dark. But dry. Shelter. Warmth if she got lucky. Clara nearly laughed from relief, though it came out weak and breathless. "Well, little guy," she murmured, shifting carefully to her feet. "Guess we are roommates now." Every step toward the cave felt heavier than the last. Snow dragged at her boots while cold stiffened her fingers around the bundle she refused to loosen. By the time she reached the entrance, her knees shook badly enough she nearly slipped. Inside, the space smelled faintly of damp stone and old smoke. Someone had used it before, though not recently. A rusted tin sat forgotten in one corner beside blackened rocks from a fire pit long gone cold. Clara sank carefully against the wall, exhaling shakily as exhaustion settled over her all at once. For a moment, she simply sat there listening to the storm rage outside, while the silence inside wrapped around her like something fragile and temporary. Then the wolf pup stirred weakly against her chest. Clara looked down and froze. The pale fur near its shoulder had darkened. Wet. Her breath caught. Blood. Not much, but enough. Enough to matter out here. Oh no. Oh no no no. Carefully, she peeled back the blanket of cloth she had wrapped around him. Beneath the snow and frost, hidden by silver fur, ran a shallow cut along the pup's side. Nothing terrible, but untreated. And freezing temperatures had only made it worse. Clara stared at it for a second too long before quietly reaching for the last clean strip of fabric she owned. Outside, somewhere beyond the storm-dark trees, a deep voice broke through the wind. "Spread out," someone ordered. "The prince has to be close. The prince has to be close." The words settled over Clara like falling ice. For a second she forgot to breathe. "Prince." Her gaze dropped immediately to the silver-white wolf pup curled weakly in her lap, the tiny rise and fall of his chest suddenly feeling far too important for something she had stumbled across by accident. No, that could not be right. This little thing? Royalty? The idea almost sounded ridiculous. Yet nothing about him had ever felt ordinary. Not the pale shimmer hidden beneath his fur. Not those strange amber eyes that seemed too aware, too intelligent somehow. Clara swallowed hard and looked back toward the narrow cave entrance where snow continued sweeping sideways through the mountain wind. Voices echoed faintly again, closer now. Organized. Searching. Fear tightened painfully inside her chest. People with power rarely saw the best in someone like Clara Hale. A packless Omega alone in the mountains holding what sounded suspiciously like a missing prince? That sounded exactly like the kind of misunderstanding that ruined lives. "Okay," she whispered softly, trying to steady her shaking hands as she reached for the strip of fabric. "We are going to fix this first." The pup barely stirred when she carefully cleaned the cut with melted snow collected from the cave wall. He let out a weak sound, barely more than a tired breath, and Clara's throat tightened unexpectedly. "I know," she murmured. "I know. I hate cold water too." The quiet joke sounded strange in the silence, but somehow talking made the cave feel less empty. Less frightening. Slowly, carefully, she wrapped the fabric around the injury as best she could. Not perfect. Barely decent, honestly. But enough to help. Enough to try. Her fingers trembled harder now, stiff from cold and exhaustion, but she kept going anyway. Because nobody had tried for her in a very long time. Outside, another voice drifted through the storm. "Nothing on the western ridge." "Search lower," someone called back. His scent disappeared here. Clara froze. Scent? Of course. Wolves tracked by scent. Panic flickered briefly through her chest before logic followed. The storm. Snow buried everything. That was the only reason she had survived this long. Weather hid people. Weather erased mistakes. Still, she shifted farther into the shadows of the cave without thinking, instinct stronger than reason. The wolf pup pressed weakly closer against her chest. Seeking warmth, he clearly no longer had strength to find himself. Clara hesitated before carefully tucking him beneath her coat. Immediate warmth spread faintly between them. Tiny. Fragile. Trusting. Something about it hurt more than she expected. "You really should have picked someone more qualified," she whispered quietly. "I am barely keeping myself alive." The pup gave the faintest movement, pressing closer anyway. Clara blinked hard against the sudden sting in her eyes. Funny, she thought distantly, how the first creature to stay close to her in years happened to be a half-frozen wolf. Exhaustion settled heavier now, pressing against her shoulders like wet stone. Her stomach ached. Her body trembled uncontrollably despite the little shelter the cave offered. She knew she should stay awake. Knew sleeping in cold temperatures was dangerous. But her eyelids had begun feeling too heavy. Just for a minute, she told herself. Just long enough to rest. Outside, snow crunched suddenly much closer than before. Boots. More than one pair. Clara went perfectly still. Then a deep voice, calm and commanding even through the storm, spoke just beyond the cave entrance. "Something is here." Clara stopped breathing. The voice outside carried through the storm with a quiet certainty that somehow felt more frightening than shouting ever could. Calm. Controlled. The kind of voice people obeyed without question. Snow crunched closer to the cave entrance, slow measured steps approaching through the dark. Her pulse slammed hard against her ribs. No. No, no, no. Not now. Not like this. Instinct moved faster than reason. Clara pulled the wolf pup closer beneath her coat and shifted deeper into the shadows where the cave narrowed, pressing herself against cold stone as if she could somehow disappear into it. Her body trembled so hard now she worried the sound alone might give her away. Stay quiet. Stay invisible. That rule had kept her alive for years. Outside, another voice spoke, sharper this time. There are tracks here. A pause followed. Fresh. Clara closed her eyes briefly. Of course there were tracks. She had walked straight through the ravine like an idiot, too exhausted to think ahead. Her stomach twisted painfully. Maybe if they found the pup, they would leave her alone. Maybe if she explained, except explanations had never worked for girls like Clara Hale. People saw what they expected to see. Accursed Omega. Trouble. Bad luck wrapped in pale skin and tired eyes. The tiny body pressed against her chest stirred weakly again. And before Clara could stop herself, she instinctively adjusted the fabric around him to keep him warmer. A tiny sound escaped the pup, barely more than a sleepy breath. Silence fell outside. Then came another crunch of boots. Closer. Too close. Clara held perfectly still. The cave entrance darkened suddenly as a figure stepped into the opening, broad enough to block what little storm light filtered inside. Snow clung to the heavy black coat covering his shoulders, melting slowly against dark leather gloves. Tall. Larger than anyone Clara had ever seen up close. But it was not size that unsettled her. It was presence. Something about the man filled the space too easily, quiet but impossible to ignore. Power settled around him the way winter settled over mountains. Natural. Unavoidable. His gaze swept once across the cave, sharp enough Clara felt seen even before his eyes landed directly on her. Silver. Not gray. Not blue. True silver. Bright even in shadow. Clara's breath caught painfully in her throat. For one impossible second nobody moved. Then the man's eyes lowered slowly to the shape hidden beneath her coat. The wolf pup. The smallest shift crossed his expression. Not relief exactly. Something tighter. Controlled. There you are, he said quietly, though the words were not meant for her. The pup stirred immediately. Weak moments ago, he suddenly pushed clumsily free from Clara's coat with surprising determination. Hey, wait! Clara reached instinctively. But the tiny wolf had already stumbled forward across the cave floor. Straight toward the stranger. The man crouched immediately, one gloved hand steadying the pup with surprising gentleness. His expression changed again, softer this time. Familiar. Clara stared in silence, confusion knotting tighter inside her chest. The pup leaned heavily against the stranger's leg, exhausted but safe in a way Clara somehow understood without explanation. Slowly, painfully, realization settled over her. Prince. Oh God. She had really been carrying somebody important. Panic arrived half a second later. She pushed herself awkwardly to her feet, nearly slipping against the cave wall. I did not steal him, she blurted immediately, voice rough from cold and nerves. I found him outside and he was freezing and Her sentence cut off when the man stood. Even exhausted, Clara realized one impossible thing instantly. This was not a guard. Not an ordinary wolf. Because every instinct inside her had suddenly gone perfectly terrifyingly still. The silence inside the cave changed shape. Clara felt it instantly. Heavy. Still. Like the entire mountain had suddenly paused to wait for something she did not understand. The man stood slowly, snow melting from the edge of his dark coat onto the stone floor while the wolf pup remained pressed close against his boots. Those silver eyes returned to her, calm and unreadable in a way that somehow made Clara even more nervous. Nobody that quiet ever needed to raise their voice. You found him out there? He asked at last, his tone steady, low enough to somehow cut through the storm without effort. Clara nodded too quickly. Near the ravine, she said, words stumbling out faster now. He was freezing and hurt and I just did not want to leave him. She hesitated, suddenly aware of how ridiculous she probably looked. Half frozen. Exhausted. Covered in snow with shaking hands and barely enough strength left to stand. I know he probably belongs somewhere important, she added carefully, swallowing hard. I was going to leave once the storm passed. Something unreadable flickered briefly across the stranger's expression. Not suspicion exactly. Surprise maybe. Outside, more footsteps approached the cave entrance. Several figures appeared through the snow, broad-shouldered men dressed in dark winter gear. their faces immediately sharpening with visible relief when they spotted the wolf pup. "Your Highness," one of them breathed quietly, lowering his head at once. Clara blinked. "Highness." Her stomach dropped so suddenly she thought she might actually fall over. "Oh no. Oh, absolutely not." Slowly, painfully, her gaze lowered to the tiny wolf now leaning against the stranger's leg like he had never belonged anywhere else. Prince. Actual prince. Royal prince. Of course. Because apparently surviving 5-pack rejections and a mountain storm was not dramatic enough for 1 week. The stranger crouched again, one gloved hand gently brushing snow from the pup's pale fur. "You should not wander off like this," he said quietly, and for the first time warmth touched his voice. Tired warmth. Familiar warmth. The kind that only came from someone who cared deeply but had been worried far too long. The pup nudged weakly against his hand before glancing back toward Clara. Those bright amber eyes lingered on her for a moment. Trusting. Reluctant somehow. The strange ache returned unexpectedly to Clara's chest. "He stayed with me," she murmured before she could stop herself. "Mostly because I think he was too stubborn not to." One of the guards stepped closer then, gaze flicking toward Clara with obvious uncertainty. "Sir," he began carefully, "we should move quickly. The weather is worsening." "Sir." "Not your majesty." But nobody questioned him. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody stood fully upright around him either. Clara noticed that now. The respect in the room felt instinctive. Automatic. Like gravity. Something cold settled slowly into her stomach. There was only one person in the Northern Territories people obeyed like that. One man whose presence alone made entire packs lower their heads. No. No way. Her pulse stumbled again. The stranger looked back at her just as realization crossed her face. Silver eyes. Black coat. Quiet authority. The mountain seemed suddenly too small for the truth standing 3 feet away. "You are freezing," he said simply, as if her entire internal crisis had not just happened. Clara opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. "You are." Her voice failed completely. The storm outside howled harder, but somehow it sounded distant now. Because standing in front of her, holding the kingdom's missing prince in his arms, was the one person Clara Hale had spent years hearing stories about in frightened whispers. The Alpha King. Clara forgot how to breathe. The Alpha King stood less than 6 feet away, snow still melting from the shoulders of his black coat, silver eyes impossibly calm despite the storm raging outside and the kingdom's missing prince tucked safely against his arm. Every story she had ever heard rushed back at once. King Rowan Blackwood. The Winter King. The ruler powerful enough that entire packs lowered their heads when he entered a room. A man whispered about in taverns and campfires with equal parts admiration and fear. They said he never smiled. They said mercy was rare. They said crossing him ruined lives. Clara's stomach dropped somewhere near her knees. Wonderful. Just wonderful. Somehow, after 5 packs rejected her, she had accidentally hidden in a cave with the most powerful wolf in the country. Her legs suddenly felt much less steady. "I can explain," she said too quickly, then immediately regretted how nervous she sounded. "I really did just find him. I was not trying to take him anywhere or hide him or—" Her voice caught when dizziness rolled suddenly through her body. The cave tilted unpleasantly for half a second. Too cold. Too tired. Too hungry. She steadied herself against the stone wall before she embarrassed herself by collapsing directly in front of royalty. Rowan Blackwood watched her carefully, expression unreadable. Not cold exactly. Studying. Like he was quietly putting pieces together. His gaze flicked briefly to the torn gloves covering her shaking hands. The soaked boots. The thin coat barely protecting her from the mountain storm. Then to the strip of fabric wrapped carefully around the prince's injury. "You treated his wound," he said finally. Clara blinked once. "It looked worse in the cold," she admitted quietly. "I just thought." Her throat tightened unexpectedly. "I did not want him to be alone out there." Something shifted in the cave then. Small. Nearly invisible. But several of the guards exchanged glances. One man lowered his head slightly, as if reconsidering something he had assumed about her. The prince stirred weakly in Rowan's arms and, to Clara's surprise, lifted his head just enough to look toward her again. A tiny sound escaped him. Soft. Familiar. Like recognition. Clara felt something twist strangely in her chest. Rowan noticed too. His silver gaze lowered briefly to the young wolf before returning to her. He trusts you, he said quietly. The statement unsettled her more than accusation would have. Trust. Nobody used words like that about Clara Hale. Not in years. I think he was mostly cold, she said softly, attempting a weak joke that barely landed. The corner of one guard's mouth twitched before he quickly looked away. Outside, the storm grew louder, wind scraping hard against stone. Snow had already begun piling higher near the cave entrance. One of the men stepped forward. Your Majesty, he said carefully, the mountain path will be dangerous if we wait longer. Your Majesty. The words landed harder this time. Real. Heavy. Rowan nodded once but did not move immediately. Instead, his attention stayed fixed on Clara long enough to make her nervous again. How long have you been out here? He asked. Clara hesitated. Since this morning. A pause. Maybe longer. She honestly was not sure anymore. Hunger blurred time strangely. Rowan's expression changed so subtly most people might have missed it. But Clara saw it. A brief tightening near his jaw. Not anger. Something quieter. Concern maybe. Impossible. Men like him did not worry about girls like her. You are freezing, he said again, more firmly this time. Clara opened her mouth to insist she was fine. The words never made it out. Her knees suddenly gave way beneath her. The cave floor rushed toward Clara too fast for her exhausted body to react. 1 second she was standing, trying desperately not to embarrass herself in front of the Alpha King, and the next her knees gave out completely. The cold stone tilted beneath her vision. Dark spots blooming at the edges like storm clouds closing in. Somewhere far away someone said her name. Or maybe she imagined that part. Strong hands caught her before she hit the ground. Warmth followed immediately after, startling enough that Clara's eyes fluttered open again. Rowan Blackwood had somehow crossed the distance between them without her noticing. One arm steadied her carefully, while the other kept the prince secure against his side. Up close, the scent of pine, winter air, and something faintly metallic surrounded him, clean and grounding in a way that felt strangely unreal. Clara blinked slowly, struggling to focus. I am okay, she murmured automatically, because it was what people said when they had spent years trying not to become someone else's burden. Her voice sounded weak even to herself. Rowan looked unconvinced. No, he said quietly. You are not. The simple honesty of it unsettled her more than criticism ever could. Nobody had looked at Clara in years and spoken like her suffering mattered. Most people simply looked away. One of the guards stepped closer carrying a thick wool blanket from a pack. Your Majesty, he said carefully, concern flickering briefly across his face. She looks close to hypothermia. Hypothermia. The word felt distant somehow. Too serious. Too dramatic for somebody like Clara Hale. She wanted to argue. Wanted to insist she had survived worse. But exhaustion dragged at her harder now. Heavy and thick inside her bones. The prince stirred suddenly against Rowan's arm, lifting his head weakly before making the softest sound Clara had heard yet. Then, to everyone's surprise, the tiny wolf shifted awkwardly free and moved toward her again. Not graceful, barely steady, but determined. Clara frowned in confusion as the pup pressed himself against her side, curling weakly against her coat like he had already decided exactly where he belonged. Silence settled across the cave. One of the guards blinked. Another quietly lowered his head. That is, someone began then stopped. Rowan's gaze lingered briefly on the prince before lifting back to Clara. Something unreadable crossed his expression again. Thoughtful now. Measuring. He should not have enough energy to move much, one guard said quietly. Not after 3 days missing. 3 days. Clara's breath caught softly. He had been alone out there for 3 days. No wonder he looked so tired. Her hand moved before she thought about it, brushing carefully through the silver fur near his ear. You stubborn thing, she whispered quietly. You should have let somebody find you sooner. The pup leaned faintly into her touch. Rowan noticed that too. Of course he noticed. Men like him probably noticed everything. Outside, the storm roared harder against the mountain walls. Snow continued building near the cave entrance faster than before. One of the guards glanced toward the weather with concern. "We need to leave now, Your Majesty." Rowan nodded once. Then his attention returned fully to Clara. "Can you walk?" he asked. Clara wanted desperately to say yes. Pride pushed the word toward her tongue. But her body answered first when another wave of dizziness rolled through her hard enough to steal her balance again. Embarrassment burned painfully through her exhaustion. "Probably not very gracefully," she admitted quietly. For the first time since entering the cave, something changed in Rowan Blackwood's face. Small, brief, but unmistakable. The faintest hint of amusement. Then he reached for the blanket, wrapped it around her shoulders himself, and said something Clara never expected to hear from the Alpha King. "Then I suppose you will have to let me help you." Clara stared at him as though she had misunderstood the words entirely. "Let me help you." Nobody said things like that to her. Not anymore. Help usually came with conditions. Pity. Judgment. A quiet expectation that she should apologize for existing long before anyone had to say the words aloud. Yet Rowan Blackwood stood in front of her like the offer was the simplest thing in the world. Like helping a freezing stranger mattered. The wool blanket settled heavier around her shoulders as warmth slowly began creeping back into skin she had almost forgotten belonged to her. Clara opened her mouth to refuse automatically. Pride had survived even after everything else had not. "I do not want to be trouble," she murmured quietly instead. The sentence slipped out before she could stop it. Rowan's expression shifted in a way she could not quite understand. Not irritation. Something quieter. Sadder almost. "You saved my son," he said simply. "You are not trouble." The words landed strangely hard somewhere deep inside her chest. Saved my son. Clara looked instinctively toward the tiny wolf curled against her side, his breathing steadier now despite exhaustion weighing heavily over him. Son. Of course. Prince. Royal family. It still felt impossible somehow. "I just found him," she said softly. Anybody would have helped. Several guards exchanged glances again, and for the first time Clara noticed the silence that followed her words. The kind of silence that said nobody entirely believed that. Rowan did not argue. He only crouched beside the prince and brushed gentle fingers through the pale fur near the young wolf's neck. "No," he said quietly after a moment. "Not everybody would have." Outside, the storm howled harder, rattling frozen branches against stone. One guard stepped near the entrance and frowned toward the deepening snow. "We cannot stay much longer, Your Majesty. Visibility is getting worse." Rowan nodded once. Decision settled visibly across him then, calm and immediate. The kind of confidence people probably followed into impossible situations without question. He stood and shrugged off the heavy black coat covering his shoulders. Clara blinked immediately. "Wait," she said, confused. "You need that." Ignoring the protest completely, Rowan stepped closer and carefully settled the coat around her shoulders over the blanket. Warmth wrapped around her instantly. Real warmth. Deep warmth that smelled faintly like cedar, winter air, and something grounding she could not explain. The coat swallowed her completely, heavy enough to almost reach her knees. Clara looked up quickly. "I cannot take this." "You can," Rowan said. "Because right now you need it more." Nobody had spoken to her like that in years. Not firmly. Not kindly. Certainly not like someone whose survival mattered. The prince stirred then, lifting his head weakly before nudging against Clara's side again as if confirming his opinion on the situation. One of the guards gave a quiet breath that sounded suspiciously close to amusement. "Looks like Prince Elias has already made his choice," he muttered. Clara frowned softly. "Elias," she repeated quietly. The name somehow made the tiny wolf seem even smaller. Younger. Less like royalty and more like somebody's frightened kid who got lost in the storm. Rowan noticed the way her expression softened. "He trusts very few people," he said. "Especially after being frightened." Clara hesitated before reaching down to gently scratch behind the prince's ear. Elias leaned immediately into her touch. "I think he is just stubborn," she said softly. To her surprise, Rowan let out the quietest breath of something dangerously close to laughter. Brief. Gone almost immediately. But real enough that every guard in the cave suddenly looked deeply confused. Then Rowan straightened, his expression settling again. "We are leaving now," he said calmly. His silver gaze returned to Clara. "And before you argue," he added quietly, "I am not asking." Then before Clara could even process the words, the Alpha King bent slightly and lifted her into his arms. Clara forgot every word she had ever known. 1 second she stood there trying to understand what exactly the Alpha King meant by "I am not asking," and the next the ground disappeared entirely beneath her feet. A startled breath escaped before she could stop it as Rowan Blackwood lifted her as though the effort meant absolutely nothing. Heat surrounded her immediately. Real warmth. Not imagined. Not stolen from threadbare blankets or fading campfires, but solid and steady in a way her body seemed to recognize before her mind could. "You really cannot do that," Clara said weakly after several stunned seconds, though even she heard how little conviction remained in her voice. Rowan adjusted his hold slightly, steady and careful despite the storm waiting outside the cave. "I already did," he said simply. One of the guards looked suspiciously like he was trying not to smile. Clara opened her mouth again, then closed it. "Fair point." Elias made a soft sound from Rowan's other arm, pale fur pressed comfortably against his father's chest. To Clara's complete confusion, the prince twisted slightly and stretched one paw toward her blanket as if checking she was still there. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. "I think he likes you," one guard murmured quietly. Clara blinked immediately. "That seems like poor judgment," she said before thinking. A few guards exchanged glances again, and somewhere near the back someone made a suspicious sound that almost resembled a laugh. Rowan's expression remained calm, but Clara noticed the smallest shift near the corner of his mouth. Not quite amusement. Close enough to unsettle her anyway. Nobody had ever told Clara she mattered enough for royalty to care whether she collapsed. Outside, the storm hit hard the moment they stepped from the cave. Wind tore across the mountainside sharp enough to steal breath straight from her lungs. Snow swirled thick and blinding around them, reducing the world to little more than white and shadow. Yet somehow, held securely against Rowan's chest beneath the heavy coat wrapped around her shoulders, Clara no longer felt the cold quite so sharply. The warmth surrounding him reached through every frozen layer she wore, stubborn and steady. Dangerous, she thought distantly. Dangerous to get used to kindness. Her body had already started betraying her. Exhaustion settling heavier now that survival no longer felt entirely up to her alone. She hated that. Hated how quickly relief made her weak. Rowan moved carefully across the mountain path, boots steady even where snow buried most of the trail. Guards surrounded them instinctively, watching the storm with practiced focus. Nobody complained. Nobody questioned the king carrying a freezing stranger down the mountain, which somehow made Clara even more embarrassed. "You can put me down," she tried quietly after several minutes. "Really? I can probably walk." Rowan glanced down once. Silver eyes calm. Unimpressed. "You nearly collapsed twice in 10 minutes. Clara frowned slightly beneath the blanket. "That feels unnecessarily specific." This time there was no mistaking it. A brief flicker of amusement crossed Rowan's face before disappearing beneath composure again. "I notice things," he said simply. The answer should not have unsettled her. Yet somehow it did. Because nobody noticed Clara Hale. Not usually. Not unless something went wrong. Wind swept harder across the ridge, and instinctively Clara shifted closer against the warmth surrounding her before immediately freezing in embarrassment. Wonderful. Fantastic. Now she was accidentally clinging to the Alpha King like she had completely forgotten basic dignity. But Rowan said nothing about it. Only adjusted the coat slightly around her shoulders to block more wind. Then somewhere through the storm ahead, lights appeared. Warm golden lights glowing faintly through the snow. A camp. Shelter. Safety. Relief hit Clara so suddenly it almost hurt. Until one terrible realization followed immediately after. Safety usually meant questions. Questions meant explanations. And explaining why a Packless Omega had been alone in the mountains with the missing prince suddenly felt far more frightening than the storm. Warmth hit Clara so suddenly it almost hurt. The camp sat hidden beneath towering pines at the edge of the mountain ridge, lanterns glowing gold against the storm-dark night, while thick canvas tents stood firm beneath layers of fresh snow. Smoke curled from iron fire pits, carrying the scent of cedarwood and something rich enough to make Clara's painfully empty stomach twist hard in protest. Soup maybe. Bread. Real food. Her body noticed before pride had the chance to interfere. The moment Rowan stepped beneath the largest covered shelter, voices immediately fell quiet. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Wolves stood straighter. Several lowered their heads without hesitation. Respect moved through the camp like instinct, quiet and immediate. Clara suddenly became painfully aware of herself. Snow soaked through her clothes, hair tangled, hands shaking beneath gloves worn thin enough to nearly see skin through the seams. And currently somehow being carried by the Alpha King like she belonged there. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Your Majesty, an older woman said quickly, stepping forward from beside one of the fires. Her silver hair had been braided tightly beneath a thick winter hood. Sharp eyes immediately scanning Rowan before landing on Elias. Relief softened her expression instantly. Prince Elias. The young wolf stirred weakly at the sound of his name, lifting his head just enough for the woman to let out a quiet breath. Thank the moon, she whispered softly. Then her attention shifted to Clara. Sharp again. Assessing. Not cruel. Exactly. Careful. And who, she asked slowly, is this? Clara's stomach dropped. There it was. Questions. Rowan answered before she could force words through suddenly dry lips. Someone who kept my son alive, he said calmly. The entire shelter went still. Clara blinked once, certain she had heard him wrong. Kept my son alive. Nobody had ever described Clara Hale as someone who saved anything. Usually people blamed her for what went wrong. A younger guard near the fire frowned slightly. This Omega? He asked before immediately looking like he regretted speaking at all. Rowan's silver gaze lifted slowly. Calm. Quiet. Somehow worse than anger. Yes, he said simply. Silence followed immediately. Clara noticed the guard straighten at once. Nobody argued. Nobody questioned further. The older woman stepped closer instead, concern replacing caution when she noticed Clara's trembling hands and pale face. She is freezing, she said quietly. Exhausted too. I noticed, Rowan replied, voice softer than Clara expected. Again with that strange thing. Noticing her. Like she mattered enough to see. Get the healer, he said. And food. Clara shook her head immediately despite the dizzy exhaustion weighing her down. I am okay, she started automatically. Several people looked at her. Nobody appeared convinced. Least of all Rowan. You nearly collapsed on a mountain, he said quietly. Twice. Clara frowned weakly beneath the oversized coat wrapped around her shoulders. You keep counting. Something unexpected happened then. A few guards looked suddenly terrified of their own expressions, as though trying very hard not to smile. Even the older woman blinked in surprise. Because for the briefest second, Rowan Blackwood looked dangerously close to amused again. Before Clara could understand what she had possibly said, Elias made another soft sound and twisted awkwardly from Rowan's arms toward her. Without thinking, Clara reached out instinctively. The prince settled immediately against her shoulder with a tiny exhausted sigh. The entire shelter went silent again. One guard quietly muttered, "That has never happened before." Clara frowned softly. "What?" Nobody answered. Right away. Instead, all eyes slowly shifted toward Rowan Blackwood. The Alpha King watched the scene in complete silence, silver eyes unreadable. Then, quietly enough that only those nearest heard it, he said something that made the entire tent feel suddenly too small. He trusts her more than anyone outside our bloodline. Clara did not understand why everyone suddenly looked at her like she had done something extraordinary. Elias rested quietly against her shoulder, warm now beneath the oversized coat Rowan had wrapped around her, his tiny breathing soft and steady near her neck. To Clara, he still felt less like royalty and more like a frightened little thing who had simply needed somebody to stay. Yet the silence inside the shelter had changed again. Not suspicious anymore. Curious. Careful. Like nobody entirely knew what to make of the packless Omega holding the prince who trusted almost no one. Clara shifted awkwardly beneath the attention. "I think he is just tired," she said quietly, glancing toward Rowan. "That is probably all." The older woman near the fire let out a soft hum that sounded deeply unconvinced. Prince Elias barely lets palace healers near him when he is frightened, she said gently. Yet somehow he crossed a cave to sit with you. Clara blinked. Oh, brilliant response. Really impressive. Exhaustion had officially stolen whatever social skills she had left. Rowan remained silent, silver eyes steady in a way that somehow made Clara more aware of every awkward movement she made. Not cold. Never cold exactly. Watching. Measuring. Like he had quietly decided there was something worth understanding about her. The realization unsettled her more than it should have. Because people did not study Clara Hale unless they expected disappointment eventually. A healer arrived moments later, kneeling quickly beside Elias with practiced care. The prince grumbled softly at first, clearly unhappy about leaving Clara's shoulder, but settled once Rowan rested a hand briefly against his fur. Relief spread visibly through the camp as the healer quietly confirmed the injury was minor, the exhaustion manageable. Another day out there would have been dangerous, she admitted softly. Whoever found him kept him warm. Again eyes shifted toward Clara. Again she wanted desperately to disappear into the floor. Rowan looked at her once, then toward the gathered wolves nearby. She kept him alive through a mountain storm, he said calmly. Do not forget that. Something strange moved through the camp at his words. Respect. Real respect. Not pity. Not obligation. Clara almost did not recognize it. One guard lowered his head slightly toward her. Another offered her a steaming mug without hesitation. Nobody whispered. Nobody looked afraid. Nobody treated her like something unfortunate had wandered in from the cold. It felt so unfamiliar Clara almost distrusted it. The healer turned toward Clara next, concern immediately replacing professionalism. You should be in bed, she said gently. Warm room. Food. Sleep. Clara opened her mouth to protest automatically. I really do not want to inconvenience, Rowan interrupted before she finished. You are staying with us. Clara froze. What? Until you recover, Rowan said simply, as though discussing whether instead of completely changing her life, you are not returning to the mountains tonight. Panic fluttered quietly beneath her ribs. Stay? With the Alpha King? In the royal camp? People like Clara did not stay near power. Power noticed mistakes. Power remembered names. I can leave tomorrow, she offered carefully. I do not want trouble. Rowan's expression shifted again. That same quiet thing she still could not name. Frustration maybe. Or disappointment. You keep saying that, he said softly. But Clara. Hearing her name in his voice startled her enough she looked up immediately. Nobody important ever remembered her name. You saved my son, Rowan continued quietly. You survived a storm most wolves would not have. His silver gaze held hers steadily. Calm. Certain. You do not seem to understand this yet, he said. But nobody is sending you away.